ago, I was talking to a friend who teaches at a local girls' school. And she and her girls had decided to do a service project. And the girls wanted to knit scarves for the homeless people in their community. So first they went to the yarn store and they picked out the most beautiful yarn they could find. Then they took knitting lessons to make sure that they got scarves and not pot holders. And after taking those lessons and doing the work, they ended up with 50 beautiful scarves to give away. They took them to the shelter and they were vibrating with excitement as they approached the man at the front desk. They opened up their bag filled with hours of their work, and he looked inside and oohed and awed over these beautiful scarves. But then, as the girls walked away, he whispered to my friend, "They're beautiful, but I don't think they'll wear them." Can you see why the homeless people might not wear those scarves? I couldn't see it at the time, but I do now. And it helps me to see that perspective is better than empathy. We talk a lot about empathy, we embrace it, we encourage it, we even try to mandate it, but I'm not really sure that we understand it. When you dive into the research on empathy, you will see that there's a number of different definitions of empathy. Daniel Goleman, who is the author of Emotional Intelligence and the contributor to the Harvard Business Review book on empathy, has defined two different kinds of empathy. There's cognitive empathy, the ability to see things through another person's perspective. And then there's emotional empathy, which is the ability to feel what another feels. We tend to focus on emotional empathy, feeling what someone else feels. But I know that seeing what other people see, what we're going to call perspective, is the most important thing if you want to change the world. Let's go back to those scarves. You might see scarves as warm, cozy, and soft. Now see them from a homeless person's perspective. Does anything change? I learned the difference between perspective and empathy in my years as a trial attorney. For over 20 years, I defended doctors when their patients sued them. And when a doctor is sued, they are feeling afraid, ashamed, and angry. If I felt my doctor, my client's feelings, I was not going to be able to help them through the case, and in fact, it could actually hurt. There was one situation where it hurt pretty badly. I represented a young female surgeon, and she reminded me a lot of myself, driven, ambitious, and maybe a little bit obsessive. When you can relate to someone, when you can identify with someone, research shows that you actually feel more empathy for them, and I certainly did with her. She was distressed about being sued, and I felt her distress. And then the weekend before we were to have opening statements, she got a call from her boss. She called me to tell me about the call. Her boss had told her that if we lost the case, she was going to lose her job. Now, she had wanted this job for her entire career, and she had moved herself and her family across the country to take this job. And as she told me all of this, I could feel her fear and her anger and her frustration. And slowly, I could see that my lips were expanding until they touched the top of my nose. I was having an allergic reaction to my own stress hormones. And I ended up spending that night in the emergency room, hooked up to an IV of Benadryl and steroids as an antidote to my empathy. My empathy was not going to help me to advocate for my client. And if I wanted to be a strong advocate for her and for all of my future clients, I had to learn to feel less and see more. I had to learn perspective. Perspective would allow me to be a stronger advocate for my client. If I could see the case from her perspective, I could speak to her concerns. I could speak to them in a way that maybe would change the way that she saw things, so that she wouldn't be so afraid and scared. And if I could see the case from a jury's perspective, then I could get to work to try to change it. Perspective beats empathy in the courtroom. Now let's talk healthcare. If a doctor feels their patient's feelings, they're going to feel pain, fear, confusion, and anxiety. That doesn't serve a patient or their doctor. But if a doctor can see the matter from the patient's perspective, they know what to say, they know what to explain, they know how to advocate for their patients, and they know how to advocate to their patients to help their patients make choices that will lead to better health. They're also likely to reduce burnout and be able to be more compassionate when they see things from others' perspective without picking up on those feelings. Perspective beats empathy in healthcare. Perspective even beats empathy in the corporate world. According to a study in the Journal of Business Psychology, one of the most effective forms of diversity training is having people write about things from another's perspective. Specifically in this study, they had a group of people write about a day from the perspective of an LGBTQ individual or a racial minority, seeing a day and the challenges that that person might face from their perspective. And after doing that exercise, the participants improved their attitudes and their intentions towards those groups, and those improvements lasted for up to 8 months. Even more interesting, the improvements were cross-referential, which means that if they had a positive attitude, they were writing about LGBTQ individuals, they also improved their attitudes towards racial minorities and vice versa. Perspective beat empathy in the corporate world as well. Perspective taking can make every single one of you a better advocate. When you communicate, you share perspectives, but when you advocate, you change them. Whose perspective do you want to change? It could be a client, a partner, a friend, a family member. When you want to change someone's perspective, you have got to see theirs first. You have got to understand them. Once you do, then you can get to work trying to change their perspective. You know, in all of those years defending doctors in medical malpractice cases, I never had a single doctor on any of my juries. In fact, I never had a single doctor in the courtroom other than my client, but every single member of every single jury and every single person in the courtroom, including the judge, was a patient. They all saw the world from a patient's perspective. My job was to change that, and the only way that I could change that would be to understand the patient's perspective, the juror's perspective. And then I could use evidence and stories that would speak to that perspective. Let's go back to those scarves. When those girls were knitting the scarves for the homeless people, they were using a form of empathy. They were feeling the homeless people's cold. But because they weren't seeing the world from a homeless person's perspective, they couldn't see that for homeless people, scarves can be deadly weapons. They couldn't see that when you're homeless and you're sleeping on the street, a scarf is a way that you can be strangled in your sleep. They couldn't see that socks would have been a much better choice. Now, you can see others' perspective, and it just takes a little bit of work and a little bit of practice, and the easiest way, the best way to do it is to ask them. Ask people, what is your perspective? How do you see the world and why? And then listen to their answers with true curiosity. When you do this, you start to see other perspectives, and then you can take action that speaks to that perspective. And that action will be so much more effective. You know, I recently saw my friend, and once again, they're doing a service project this year, but this year, their approach has completely changed. Now, they really work to think about the perspective of the people that they want to serve. This year, they decided that they wanted to serve the women at the local women's shelter, and they knew those women were likely feeling fear, frustration, anger, and confusion, but they didn't try to feel those feelings. Instead, they tried to see the world from those women's perspective, and they decided that they would give them socks and underwear. But then they went a step further, and they went to the shelter, and they talked to the leaders there, and the leaders said, socks and underwear are a great idea. And then the girls got to work, and they started knitting more scarves, and then they sold them, and with the money that they earned, they bought socks and underwear. And the women at that shelter were very happy with what they received. Scarves can be a big mistake. They can be deadly weapons, or they can be the source of enormous good. It all depends on your perspective. Thank you.